first part of Module 5 here, we're actually going to discuss scope. So essentially, what do we mean by scope? Well, scope is the way you go about kind of planning your project, keeping it on track, making sure it's going to attain success. Scope is the summation of the budget, the work, the undertaking, the resources, the people, the time, the things that are going to be done, how they're going to be done, how much it's going to cost to do those things. Scope really is how you're going to go about doing the project and what's going to be required to successfully do the project. So scope becomes a really big issue when projects are overwritten, are underbid, or even a combination of both. With your phase one, you're really going to be focused on establishing the feasibility of the technology. How is this going to work? Can this actually work? What can I do to demonstrate that this has the potential to work? Remember, you're not going to try and solve the issue or solve the problem in your phase one. Typically, you're just going to show that there's a path forward there. There's something you can do. There's some research and maybe some limited testing you can do during that 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long your phase one is, to show that I think this can happen. I think this makes sense. I think this can be something that is essentially doable. And because of that, for most phase ones, your budget is going to be a lot of labor. It's going to be a lot of people time to do research, people time to, analyze samples, people time to whatever it is that has to be done, as part of that experimentation plan to really show that there's something here. We reached this milestone, we reached this goal, we reached this data set. So we can show that with a little more time and a little more funding, we can create the solution. We can create this thing that's revolutionary and innovative. And one of the big things that you really want to focus on and pay attention to as it relates to scope. So scope obviously plays largely into your budget. We have to know what the scope is. You have to look at the budget. You have to refine those. But whenever you're actually starting down the pathway for your phase one proposal, have an idea of what objectives are you going to do? What are the specific tasks that you're going to undertake? Why are you going to undertake those tasks? Because those objectives really do inform your scope for your project. They're going to inform what you're going to do, what kind of resources you're going to need, what kind of validation testing are you going to have to do? How are you going to analyze that testing? How are you going to show that there's not bias here, that I'm not just taking results and running with them, that I'm actually being, kind of discreet and scientific with those results. It's really the focus of how are we going to proceed forward in this phase one? And one of the other things that is kind of important to talk about with scope as really relates to your phase one is a lot of people will over promise on their phase one. They'll say, well, I can do these 8 or 9 different things with this amount of funding. And a lot of times when you do that, the very first thing that it's going to scream to the reviewer is they really don't understand the problem. They really don't understand the science behind this. They don't understand how integral this stuff is and actually how long it's going to take to figure this out. So, on your phase one, a good objective count is probably 3, maybe 4, maybe even 2. Because remember, once you factor out things like, your indirect cost, which we're going to go over when we talk about budget, your fees, everything that's going to come out of that, when it comes to the actual direct cost of doing work, probably going to be about half of what that ceiling is. So what can you reliably do between a team of more than likely 2, 3, maybe even 4 people with that small amount of money? Well, it's probably going to be 2 or 3 very focused objectives to show that there's potential here. This thing can work. this thing might be able to happen. Scope, again, kind of isn't just about what you're going to do. Remember, it's how you're going to do it, how you're going to go about it, what's going to be required. This kind of is the driver's seat for your project. It's, again, how you kind of lay down those aims, lay down those tasks. One of the things that you kind of have to keep in mind when you think about scope, and a lot of people will kind of gloss over it, is it also needs to include that testing and validation. So it's great to have a task. It's great to have an objective. It's great to have an aim that says, we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to go about it. But how are you going to validate those results? How do you know you essentially, reach the quote-unquote finish line for that task? How do you know that you've actually shown that this might work? This actually could be feasible in the future. So whenever you're outlining those and whenever you're thinking about your scope, one, don't forget that testing and validation point, but two, be able to tie a metric to there. What's the goal? What's the end point? How do you know that, based on the research you've undertaken, based on the development you've undertaken during that objective, that, okay, well, as long as I can show this, I can show that this might work. I can show that this is something. And then also, whenever you're thinking about scope as it relates to your project, kind of be aware that figuring out your budget and figuring out your scope is really going to be iterative until you have it locked down. Typically, what you're going to do is you're going to define the problem, you're going to set the scope, you're going to look at the objectives, you're going to map out the tasks and the resource needs to get those objectives done. Then you're going to look at the budget and go, oh God, this is way over budget, or oh God, this is way under budget. So then you're going to have to go back to the scope and say, this is the money I have. Let me relook at what I'm going to do. Let me relook at what we're going to do. Let me relook at what we said we could accomplish. And you have to kind of hit that sweet spot. So neither your scope or your budget are a set it and forget it until they've totally walked hand in hand and they're working together. That's one of the things that you have to be ready to do is once you start figuring out that scope, once you start figuring out that budget, what you really should do before you start writing is you're probably going to take 3 or 4 stabs at this before you reach that sweet spot. So you go, well, this is what we can do. This is the budget that's going to be required. This actually lines up with the funding. We can do this. So when you're thinking about your scope, to kind of keep in mind the acronym SMART. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So you need to know how long it's going to take. You need to know what you're actually going to do. You need to know what you're going to measure and how you're going to be able to show that, we got there, we did this, we proved this. And it has to be something that you can actually do, you can actually undertake. Don't shoot for the moon and say, well, we can show this, but if we don't get there, oh well. Kind of line it up so that you have a good idea that you can get there. If you have objectives and you have a scope that is just, kind of off the wall and way out there, it shows to the reviewers, and they're not going to recommend you get an award. They're going to go, this person doesn't understand how to run a project. How do we think that if we make an investment into this company, if we make an investment into this idea, that there's going to be results from it? So, kind of keep that in mind as you're working through this. And then really, when you're thinking about your scope, make sure that it's ticking the boxes for what the agencies think the approach or the effort should be. Make sure that it aligns with where their head is for research. Make sure it aligns with where they want to go, what they think is critical, what they think needs to happen. Remember back to that review criteria. So look at that criteria. How does that actually inform your scope? How are you making sure that things are unbiased? What are those benchmarks? How are you going to establish that feasibility? What are you going to do to go about it? What resources are going to be needed, not just for the phase 1, but beyond that phase one, to transition into that phase two, to start to line you up for the commercial potential and commercial market. You're going to kind of have to really look at those and have a plan going forward. And again, that does play into your scope. The scope is so multifaceted and so integral. Can't really stress enough that it has to be one of those first things you do. So when we talked about that proposal process, actually sitting down, sketching out the scope, figuring out what you need to do, figuring out why you need to do it, and figuring out the resources, that's going to be one of the critical things you have to kind of approach when you're even looking at your storyboard, before you start setting down the first words on paper. Because you don't want to go through and write a big 15-page or 25-page or even 6-page technical narrative and then have to throw half of it away, because then you finally look at your scope and budget and go, well, this is just never going to work. Make sure those are solidified pretty well before you start writing. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of tears in your office. We really kind of briefly talked about objectives, but whenever you're looking at those objectives and how they play into the scope, the question comes up, well, what's actually a technical objective? So a technical objective pretty much is just something that you're going to do during that phase one, or even that phase two, once you get to that point. It's going to be the thing that you're trying to prove, the thing that you're going to show, the thing that you're going to say, I can establish feasibility by doing this. And you see a couple of examples here. Obviously, these examples are not really that scientific since they're ripped out of popular media and culture. But these kind of give you an idea of, how do I craft a technical objective? How do I write towards that? How am I, making sure that what I put forward that I can actually create, I can break down into kind of discrete elements? Because you really do have to think about them as discrete elements. You can't have them kind of lead one into another, because if you're not successful with that first one, how are you going to go on to that second one? How are you going to go on to that third one? So make sure that there's some variation in there. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to be totally separated out, but don't make the results of the first one hinge on the ability to do the second one. Because otherwise, if you get to a stumbling block, if you get to a roadblock during that first one, then your project is just at a wash at that point. And you have to relook at that scope again. And make sure that when you're structuring those, that you can also actually break them down into tasks, that there is some testing you can do, that there's something that you can show, there's something you can demonstrate. There are multiple things that you can undertake under that objective to push the project forward. So when you're kind of creating those technical objectives and structuring them, think about it like a research plan or an experiment. So you have your problem statement, you have your hypothesis, and you have, maybe you're going to do 3 different experiments. But when you have that experiment number 1, the sum total of the experiment isn't going to be, pour something to a beaker and see if it changes color. It's going to be a little more, nuanced than that. It's going to be a couple things you need to do. Well, first you probably need to sterilize the test tube. Then you need to, purchase the fluid or whatever it is. Those discrete things are actually the tasks that you're going to do that align to those objectives, or maybe action items. Swap in whatever word you want there, as long as it still equals, this is something that we're going to do. This is something somebody's going to have to do. This is some, quote unquote, physical work attached to this. Those are your tasks, and figuring out how long it's going to take to do that task, well, that's how you build up the hours to figure out how long it's going to take to do this objective. And then you're going to look at those objectives and go, well, there's 300 hours for that, there's 200 hours for that, I need 4 people for this. Then you know what your scope is, because you've sat down and you've broken it down and built it back up. When you're trying to do your scope, don't just start with well, it's going to be 2,000 hours. Well, how do you know that? Have you even planned these things? Have you even broken this down? Because you're going to need that level of kind of breakdown on the information whenever you're creating your proposal package. And we've covered quite a bit of information on this slide already, and various ones. But just remember that the ultimate goal of that phase one is you're addressing a critical challenge or a problem, but you may not just, more than likely, not just solving it straight out. You're thinking about how do you approach this? How do you show that this is feasible? How do you show that, this is a big issue, this is a challenge, and this is what we're doing to address that challenge. This is how we're looking at risk. This is how we're analyzing. So that, just keep that in mind as you're looking at creating your proposal package and how you're scoping this out. If you're not addressing the technical challenge, if it's not something you can break down into discrete elements, if it's not something you can put some very specific time-based task to, then you probably really need to rethink your entire project. It has to be able to be fleshed out to that level before it's going to be fundable. So I hope this was just a kind of really quick introduction into scope. What do we mean by scope? Why is it important? And how much it plays into what you're going to be able to do during your phase one, how you're going to move forward with your proposal package, and ultimately how you're going to show that the reviewers and the agencies can trust in you, because it is an amount of trust. They're trusting that if they give you money, you can do some work. You can actually show some results. You can show that something potentially groundbreaking is feasible.